In less than 5 years, it killed 1/3 of Europe. Entire villages vanished so completely that grass grew over them, and they were never rebuilt. Priests refused to give last rites. Doctors refused to see patients. Parents abandoned sick children. Children abandoned dying parents. No war in human history, not World War I, not World War II, killed a higher percentage of a continent's population in so short a time. But here's what the history books rarely tell you. The Black Death didn't just destroy, it rebuilt. And the world that rose from that catastrophe was unrecognizable from the one that fell into it. To understand how the Black Death changed the world, you first have to understand the world it destroyed. Medieval Europe in the early 14th century was a society built on rigid, almost immovable hierarchy. At the top sat kings, nobles, and the church, institutions that controlled land, law, and the eternal fate of every soul beneath them. At the bottom sat the peasantry, serfs bound to the land they worked, owing labor and loyalty to lords who owned everything around them. This was the natural order. God had ordained it. Nobody seriously questioned it. And then, in 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading ships docked in Sicily, carrying sailors who were already dying, covered in black boils, oozing blood and pus, delirious with fever, beyond saving. The port authorities ordered the ships out of harbor immediately. It was already too late. The plague had traveled the Silk Road from Central Asia, carried by fleas on black rats that swarmed the trading caravans and cargo ships crossing Eurasia. It arrived in the Crimea, moved into Constantinople, then leaped across the Mediterranean with the speed of commerce itself. By 1348, it was in France, Spain, and Italy. By 1349, England, Germany, and Scandinavia. By 1351, it had swept across Russia and turned back east. It moved faster than any news of it could travel, which meant city after city received it with no warning and no preparation whatsoever. The death toll is still staggering to reckon with. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia between 1347 and 1353. Europe alone lost somewhere between 30 and 60% of its entire population. The estimates vary because record-keeping collapsed along with everything else. Some regions were hit even harder. Florence lost perhaps 60% of its people. Hamburg and Bremen lost close to 2/3. Entire monastic communities died to the last monk. In some villages, the dead outnumbered the living so completely that survivors could not dig graves fast enough, and bodies were stacked in mass pits at the edge of towns. The psychological impact on those who survived was unlike anything human beings had previously experienced at civilizational scale. Death was nothing new to medieval people. Childhood mortality was high, life was short, violence was common. But the plague killed indiscriminately and invisibly. It took the young and healthy alongside the old and weak. It struck down priests who administered last rites. It killed doctors who treated the sick. It killed nobles in their castles, just as it killed peasants in their fields. The idea that righteousness, social standing, or physical strength could protect you dissolved completely. Medieval Europeans watched the entire framework of meaning they had been raised inside, the church, the feudal order, the predictability of divine justice, fail to explain or stop what was happening around them.
That psychological rupture had enormous consequences. Faith in the church, which had promised that righteousness would be rewarded and sin punished, was severely shaken. If God's servants were dying alongside sinners at exactly the same rate, what did that say about divine protection? Flagellant movements spread across Europe, groups of people publicly whipping themselves in desperate penance, believing the plague was God's punishment and that suffering might satisfy divine wrath. Others drew the opposite conclusion entirely, embracing a philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we certainly might die. Both responses reflected the same shattering of the old certainties. Then something unexpected happened. The survivors inherited a transformed world, and for many of them, particularly at the bottom of society, it was a better one. With 1/3 to 1/2 of the population dead, labor became the scarcest resource in Europe overnight. Farmland sat unworked, harvests rotted in fields. Lords who had spent generations holding absolute power over their serfs suddenly faced an uncomfortable new reality. If they didn't offer better conditions, their workers would simply walk to the next estate, where a desperate lord was offering exactly that. Peasant wages rose dramatically across Europe. Serfs began negotiating. Some simply left and were not dragged back. In England, peasants who had been legally bound to their lord's rand for generations began moving freely for the first time. When lords and the crown attempted to legally freeze wages at pre-plague levels, the Statute of Laborers in 1351, the fury that built over the following decades exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. It was crushed, but the direction of history had changed. Serfdom in Western Europe was ending. The feudal system, which the plague hadn't created but had catastrophically destabilized, was beginning its long unraveling. The medical profession was forced to confront its own uselessness and begin rebuilding from the ground up. Physicians trained entirely in ancient Greek and Roman texts, Galen, Hippocrates, found that their inherited wisdom offered nothing against the plague. The humiliation of that failure planted seeds of doubt in received medical authority that would eventually bloom into empirical, observation-based medicine. It would take centuries, but the plague helped crack open the intellectual rigidity that had kept European medical science frozen for 1,000 years. Art was transformed completely. Before the Black Death, European religious art was largely formal, symbolic, and hierarchical. Golden backgrounds, idealized figures, the geometry of heavenly order. After it, artists became obsessed with the body, its fragility, its suffering, its decay. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became one of the most widespread artistic motifs of the late medieval period, depicting skeletal death leading people of every rank and station in an equal procession to the grave. King and peasant, pope and beggar, all dancing together into darkness. That obsession with mortality and the physical reality of the human body would flow directly into the Renaissance, into Leonardo's anatomical drawings, into Michelangelo's tortured marble, into an entirely new way of seeing what it meant to be human. The Renaissance itself, that extraordinary explosion of art, science, philosophy, and individualism that transformed European civilization, owes more to the Black Death than most historians comfortably acknowledge. The plague didn't just clear land and raise wages, it cleared mental space. It broke the authority of institutions that had suppressed questioning for centuries. It forced survivors to rebuild meaning from scratch. And in that rebuilding, something new and restless and modern began to take shape. The Black Death killed tens of millions of people in ways too terrible to fully imagine. But from that darkness emerged a world that began moving toward individual rights, scientific inquiry, artistic humanism, and the slow, uneven, deeply contested liberation of ordinary people from systems that had owned them completely. History rarely moves forward gently. Sometimes it takes a catastrophe to break what needed breaking.